Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today. I am Brenna O'Neill, and I'm the Director of Education here at Test Innovators. Our webinar today is focused on everything that you need to know about the SAT. If you have any questions as we're going through the webinar, feel free to type those into the Q&A section, and I'll get to as many of those as I can at the end of the webinar, and any that we don't get to, we'll answer when we send a follow-up email to everyone who registered with a recording of the webinar, which is also to say we're recording this webinar, so not to worry about taking lots of notes. We'll be sending out a recording afterwards to everyone who registered. So with that, let's start with a quick overview of what we'll be talking about in today's webinar. I'm going to begin with an overview of the SAT, some information about the test structure, the sections of the test, scores, and also how that relates to admissions. And then we'll talk about some general test strategies as well as some section-specific strategies that can be quite helpful for students to know. So with that, let's start with some general information about the SAT. As you probably already know if you're here, test scores in the essay, which is optional now for the SAT, are used by college admissions departments. The SAT can be taken multiple times, and many students will take it more than once. So especially if you start early enough in the process, you'll certainly have time and wiggle room to be able to take the test on multiple occasions if you want to see if you can do better. It's offered on 7 dates each year. And as of now, the test is offered on paper. The structure of the test is that it starts with the reading section or reading test. You have 65 minutes, there are 52 questions, then students get a 10-minute break. Then they do the writing and language test, which is 35 minutes, 44 questions. And then they launch into the math portion of their testing. So they start with a no calculator section, 25 minutes and 20 questions. Then they get a short break. And then they take the calculator portion, which, as you can see, is significantly longer. It's about twice as long, 55 minutes and 38 questions. Then for students who are continuing on to take the essay, which again is optional, you have 2 minutes to stretch for a minute, and then you launch into the essay. You have 50 minutes to write, and you're given 1 prompt there. So let's talk a little bit more about each of those sections, starting with the reading section. So the reading test is entirely made up of multiple choice questions with 4 options for each of those questions. The general types of questions that students will see on this portion of the SAT are some main idea questions, then more detailed questions asking about specific parts of the passages that they've read. There's a fair portion of the SAT right now that's based on textual evidence, where students are asked to find which lines in the passage give evidence for the answer they selected to the previous question. So that's a very significant portion of this reading section. It's actually, from a preparation standpoint, this is a great part of the test actually for students to learn a fundamental reading test-taking strategy, which is to look in the passage always for evidence for correct answers. So those questions directly tie in a key reading strategy. Students will be asked about words and context as well, and then there will be some sort of text structure questions asking about how the author put together the passage that you're given, and then there are some overall analysis questions, putting things together and analyzing what you've read. The topics of the reading passages that you'll see, there's always a literature passage or a fiction passage. There's a history passage, and that will either be a US founding document or what SAT calls the great global conversation that it inspired. So examples of the types of founding documents that you might see if it's a founding document would be something like the Declaration of Independence or the Bill of Rights. And then the Great Global Conversation, that's going to be, generally those are key figures who are talking about freedom, justice, or liberty. So some people that you might see show up there would be Nelson Mandela, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King. Those are the sorts of passages you might be looking at there. Then there's a social science passage that will pull from economics or psychology or sociology. And there will be actually 2 science passages, and those generally pull from an earth science or biology or chemistry or physics. A few other details about the reading section. The order of the passages is always you first have a literature passage, then either the history or social science comes next, then there's a science passage, then the other history or social science, and then the final science passage. The passages are about 500 to 750 words, and they also include graphs here. So there will always be a graph with one of either the social science or the history passage, and then there will also be a graph with one of the science passages. So that's how SAT incorporates some of that understanding of scientific information. They incorporate that into the reading section. So if you're also potentially thinking about the ACT, that's one of the key differences, is that the SAT incorporates science into these other 2 sections, reading and writing and language, and ACT has an entirely separate section just devoted to that. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the writing and language section. So for this, again, it's all multiple choice with 4 options for each of those. And there are only 2 primary topics for questions on the writing and language section. So there are expression of ideas questions, and then there are standard English conventions. So that's all about grammar. So the English conventions are saying, do you understand how to conjugate verbs correctly? Do you understand how to use punctuation correctly? Everything like that. Do you understand common English expressions? And then expression of ideas has more to do with how something is written. So how to write things most clearly to express ideas. So that will be things like, is this redundant information? What would be the best topic sentence that introduces the information that comes next in the passage? How should you organize these sentences so that it makes sense? Those sorts of questions will fall into expression of ideas. The topics that you'll see in the writing and language section for those 4 passages will be careers, history or social studies, humanities, and science. So now let's talk about the math test. So there are 2 sections here, and the question breakdown for the no calculator section, you have 15 multiple choice questions. So just like those other sections with 4 options for each one. And then you have 5 grid-in questions. And I'll show you an example in just a second of what those are in case you haven't seen them before. So that's the no calculator section. And then the calculator portion, as we saw before, is a bit longer. So you have 30 multiple choice questions, and then you have 8 grid-in questions. And so here's an example just of what each of those looks like on a student's answer sheet as they're bubbling in their answers. So you can see on the left, that's your standard multiple choice A, B, C, D, so 4 options for each question. So that's what all of the test looks like for the reading, the writing and language, a lot of the math, except for the math questions that are grid-in, which is what this question 16 on the right is looking at. And an important thing for students to know is that they're only going to be graded based on what they bubble in to this grid-in chart. So if I were to show you really quickly what this looks like, if a student were to say, right, that they think the answer is 12, so they put that in here, they'll get no credit for that. In order to get any credit, they have to actually bubble in that answer. So they're filling in that 1 and 2 here. And of course, they should fill it in fully, which I didn't do exceptionally well, in order to ensure that they get credit. So let's talk about the topics that are tested on the math tests. You have it broken down into a few subjects, and I'll just use the same categories that SAT uses themselves, though the more granular breakdowns are often more helpful for really understanding what's being tested on these sections. So Heart of Algebra for SAT incorporates primarily a lot of linear equation and function questions, and there's a lot of that on the SAT. Then there's another category, which is problem solving and data analysis. And that includes questions that are about ratios, proportions, percentages, or units, as well as, of course, probability questions. And then data analysis, which will be any question where you're given some kind of chart, usually of information, and then asked to use that data to perform some type of calculation or accurately interpret what you've been given. Then there's another area that's called Passport to Advanced Math, and what that includes are quadratic and nonlinear functions, so it might also include exponential functions. And then there are additional topics in math, and so that incorporates much of what traditionally falls into geometry. So you have area and volume questions, you have to deal with angles, you have triangle questions, and that might be like right triangle questions as well, circles, and then also there can be some trigonometry on the test as well. So after the math tests, you have the SAT essay, which again is optional. If you're trying to figure out if you need to take the essay or not, the best thing to do is to go look at the colleges that you're applying to and see if they require the essay or not, and that just varies from college to college. And the essay, unlike other essays that students write, it's a passage-based essay. So they're going to read a passage first. It's 650 to 750 words, so that's about how long it is. They're going to read that, and then they're going to write a response that analyzes how the author builds an argument. So here's what those instructions will look like for students. And of course, this will just include specifically who the author of the given passage is. So it'll say, as you read the passage, consider how the author uses evidence, how they use reasoning, how they use stylistic or persuasive elements. So it's always going to be some type of persuasive piece of writing. The student will read the passage, and then your instructions are to write an essay that explains how the author builds an argument. So note that, as it says here, you're not explaining whether or not you agree with what the author has written. It's really more about analyzing how the author has built their argument. So with that, that's all of the sections of the SAT and some good foundational information about what's in each of those. So let's talk about scores a little bit. So the test is scored with initial point allocation of 1 point for each correct answer, and then any incorrect answers or unanswered questions, you get 0 points. And then what you see in the end is a total scaled score, and that is always on a range from 400 to 1600. And that's just a combination of 2 section scores. So the section scores are a combined reading and writing score, so that takes your reading points and your writing and language test points, sticks those together and gives you 1 section score from 200 to 800 for that. And then your 2 math tests, the no calculator and the calculator, also are combined, and then you get a score from 200 to 800 for that as well. And then separately, you also get an essay score. If you take the essay, that score will be from 2 to 8, and it analyzes 3 different aspects of your essay. So the dimensions are reading, analysis, and writing. So how well did you read the passage? How well did you understand the passage that you were given with that essay prompt? How strong is your analysis? And then how strong is your writing as you're providing that analysis and demonstrating your understanding of the passage that you were given? So now that you know what the scores are, of course, the natural question is always, what is a good score? When it comes to this, it's very dependent on what your goals are, where you're applying, what the rest of your application will look like. But to get some good directional information, one thing that can be very helpful to look at is you can just research some colleges, and many colleges will publish their average SAT or ACT scores, so you can get a sense of what scores might be a good range based on that, depending on the schools that you're interested in. Additionally, depending on what school you're going to, many schools will also provide some software that will show information like your test scores, so SAT scores, GPA, and then admissions information for various colleges. Oftentimes, so many schools you might have seen scattergrams, so where you have your test scores on one axis, GPA on the other axis, and it's just for You can look at it just for students at your school or for the broader population, so then you can get information about really how you're doing in terms of being a competitive applicant for these two, obviously the most highly quantitative pieces of data that are going into your applications. And there is a lot of other information you'll be providing as well, but just getting a general sense of where that is placing you. So now, of course, how do you prepare for that test to make sure that you're ready to do well and to get the scores that you want to get? So a good starting point is always to talk about timeline. This is not, by any means, what I'm about to present is not necessarily what any family needs to do, but it is sort of a standard timeline and a good guideline for when to start thinking about various parts of the process. So generally, late spring of sophomore year is a good time to start thinking about the SAT. And the first step is always to take a practice test just to see where you are. So you're going to get a starting point, look at your initial scores, and then you're going to know how much you need to prepare, and you'll be able to create a plan accordingly. So from that test, you'll be able to figure out which areas need work. If you have a perfect score in one of the sections already, obviously you don't need to spend too much time there, and you'll probably focus on the other sections. You can review how to answer all of the questions that you missed. So there may be some types of questions that are more difficult for you, and this is a great opportunity to learn how to tackle those questions. Do some targeted practice of those skill areas or question types, and then you'll iterate on the process. So you'll take another practice test, see your improvement, and iterate. So continue as your scores increase. Generally, it's a good idea to sort of target testing in the spring of your junior year. Some students will take their final SAT or ACT earlier than that, so you might do it the fall of your junior year and just be done with it, but spring is pretty standard. You can also take it as late, of course, as the fall of your senior year, so there's some wiggle room around that. The reason for this timeline is really just to give you enough time that it doesn't have to be a stressful process. You can just take the time you need to do the preparation that you need to do, which really varies from student to student. So generally aiming to test in the spring of your junior year. That way, when you go back to school your senior fall, you'll be able to take the time to work on the other parts of your application instead of also having to work too much thinking about your testing. Another important question when it comes to thinking about your preparation is whether you should take the SAT or the ACT. So if that's a question that you're thinking about, my recommendations are always to start by taking a full-length practice test of each one to see how it goes, which one goes better. So part of that is looking at your scores, of course, but another piece has to do with thinking about which parts may have felt better to you. So it can be a very subjective piece, like did you like or dislike the feel of the test? And some key differences there between the two tests. The timing is fairly different. So the average amount of time per question on the SAT is significantly longer than the average time on the ACT. So that can make the two tests feel different. On the SAT, you have to tackle these grid-in questions. Depending on how you feel about that, that might be stressful, or you might think that it's fun coming up with your own answer and not having multiple choice. On the SAT, you do have math formulas provided for both the no calculator and the calculator tests, so that can make a difference. And then, as I mentioned before, you have the ACT has a whole separate science section, so depending on whether that is a strength of yours and so you want to have a full section devoted to that, or perhaps you prefer having it dispersed, that could change which test might be the best fit. So with that, let's talk a bit about some strategies that are helpful for all students as they're going into the SAT. And we'll start with the basics. So elimination strategy. The SAT is mostly a multiple choice test. So of course, that's not entirely true. There are also those math grid-in questions, but it's largely a multiple choice test. And what that means is that the process of elimination is a very effective method for tackling questions, especially if you're not sure how to arrive at the correct answer perfectly. If you can eliminate wrong answers, you can often get yourself there as well. So always think about if there are answer choices that you know are wrong, and then from there, you can make educated guesses, or oftentimes you'll be able to cross off 3 using elimination, and then you'll actually know what the correct answer is. When it comes to guessing on the SAT, it's very straightforward. There's no wrong answer penalty on the test, so of course you should always answer every question. And yes, that also includes the grid-in questions. There's no reason not to just bubble something in for those questions, even if you have no idea how to answer it. And good guesses are sort of basic numbers that could be the answers to anything. So 0 or 1 generally are good ideas. That said, of course, if you can figure anything out about the question, so you have some range of what might be a reasonable answer, you can always use that to make a better educated guess. But certainly always answer every question. There's no penalty for answering incorrectly. So otherwise you're throwing away points that otherwise you might get. Another important overall strategy to use on the SAT is time management. Every single correct answer is worth the same number of points. So your goal is just to answer as many questions correctly as you can. And what that means is you don't want to dwell on the hard questions. One thing that is true about the SAT for the math sections is that they do generally increase in difficulty. So the questions at the end of the multiple choice portion of each test are harder than the ones at the beginning generally. And then the same thing happens again when you hit the grid-in questions. So the first grid-in questions you see will generally be easier than the last grid-in questions you see. So what that means specifically in terms of your time management for those math sections is that you'll hit a hard multiple choice question before you hit an easy grid-in question. So if you're starting to get stuck and those multiple choice questions are getting hard, go skip ahead to the first grid-in question because it's going to get easy again, and then you can always come back to those tough multiple choice questions. Just make sure that you always get to every question, especially the easy ones, so you get as many points as possible. So a good way to think about your strategy for time management is that you're grouping questions into either being easy or hard. Are they questions that you know how to do right away? Those are easy questions. Or are they hard questions where you're not sure actually how to tackle them immediately? In your first pass through each section, you're only going to answer the easy questions, the ones you know how to do right away. You can mark the hard questions and then come back to those in your second pass through the test. And that way, you'll make sure that you don't spend 5 minutes on a hard question when you could have answered 3 easy questions in that same amount of time. I'm also going to talk specifically about reading time management, just because this section can sometimes be one of the hardest to get through all the questions because you also have long passages that you need to read. So if you're ever having trouble getting through the reading section, learning how to skim effectively is a great strategy for finding the information you need without only getting through 2 of the passages on that whole section. So some things that are always good to look at are repeated words that you see and looking at first and last sentences. Of course, as you practice skimming effectively, in order for it to be effective, you don't want to be rushing too much. So you don't want to be moving so fast that you really have no idea what's happening in that section. Last couple time management tips. As you're launching into the test, timing is such a big piece of standardized tests. Make sure that you're keeping track of time so you always know how long you've been spending. You should know the average time you have per question for each section, so that way you'll know how far you should be in each section based on how long you've been in that section. If you are falling behind, you'll want to move a little more quickly, or if you find that you're rushing and you're way further in the section than you need to be, you can slow down and make sure that you're working really carefully. And the best way to gain a good instinct for about how you should be spending your time on each question is to practice so that you know what it feels like to spend a minute on a question or to spend 4 minutes on a question so that then you can pace yourself correctly. With that, let's launch into some specific math tips. One of the things that we see most often with students as they're taking tests like the SAT is that one of the most common mistakes has to do just with reading the questions carefully. So many times students answer the wrong question. They know exactly how to do it, but they answer a question that wasn't what the test was asking for. So reading carefully is a great way to make sure that you get every question you know how to do correct. Some good practices to help with that: underline important words and numbers, pay attention to the units that are being used so that you always are calculating the correct units for what they're asking for. And then always take 2 seconds on every question to recheck what the question was asking for. So after you've solved, you say, okay, I know that the number of green marbles is 12. I'm bubbling in 12. As you do that, look back and say, oh, and it says how many red marbles. And then you say, oh no, I was supposed to find the red marbles, not the green ones. So then that gives you a second. You'll be able to quickly, with that 2 seconds, save yourself from getting that question wrong by fixing it. A couple other things, especially if you're feeling a little bit stuck with a math question, drawing pictures can be really helpful to help you visualize the information that you're being given in the question. And as every student has heard from many math teachers throughout the ages, always share your work. One of the easiest ways to make careless errors is to try to do all of the calculations in your head. Certainly write things down. You're far less likely to make mistakes. Some key math strategies also include using estimation. So rather than always doing difficult calculations to make sure you find out exactly what the right answer is, always start with an estimation step. So figure out about how big your answer should be, and then use that to eliminate answer choices that are not possible. And sometimes, again, that process of elimination will take you right to the right answer, and you won't ever have to do those difficult or more time-consuming calculations. You also should always use the answer choices. So sometimes you can just work backwards from those. You can substitute them back into the question. You can say, okay, I'm supposed to solve for X, and the answer choices are all the possible values for X. Stick them back into the equation and see what works. A key note about this, always start with one of the middle answer choices. That will reduce the number of steps you have to do in substituting answer choice values into the question. If you start at A or D, then what you'll do is you'll figure out, oh, it needs to be bigger or smaller after you've plugged it in, but now you might have to work through all of the answer choices before you find the right answer. Whereas if you start with B or C, then if I plug in B, I'll know, okay, I need a bigger number, so then I should plug in C next, but I won't ever have to plug in every single answer choice. Last math strategy to use is to pick a value to substitute for unknown quantities. So this isn't relevant to every question, but if you do have some variables and you're a little confused about what might be happening with it, sometimes just putting in possible numbers there in place of those variables or unknown quantities, that can help to make it more tangible and can lead you to the correct answer as well. Some reading strategies. Always find evidence for your answer choices. I know I mentioned this earlier, but in order for an answer to be correct, there always has to be only one right answer. And the way that that happens is that the passage has to pretty much say whatever the correct answer choice is. So you should always be able to find evidence in the passage for the correct answer. And thinking of your own answer before you look at the answer choices can also help you to avoid getting distracted by any information or content that might seem compelling that's put into the wrong answer choices. Some other key things to keep in mind in terms of eliminating answer choices for the reading section. Avoid extreme answer choices. So words like only, always, never, none, best, worst, those are words that usually should signal this is pretty extreme. Unless you can find exactly that in the passage, it's unlikely to be the correct answer. You'll also always want to match the specificity of the question with the specificity of the answer choice. So if you're asked a main idea question and then the answer choice that you're picking is a really specific detail, that's probably not going to be the right answer because you want something more general that captures the point of the entire passage. Similarly, if you have something that's very global, a broad general answer choice, that may not be the right answer either. So always make sure it's within the scope of what the passage and the question are asking you for. With that, I've given a lot of information about the test preparation and some strategies. If you have any questions along the way as you're preparing for the SAT, thinking about the college admissions process, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions you have, and we would love to help support you. And you can go to our website at testinnovators.com/SAT, or contact our support team by email at support@testinnovators.com, or call us at 1-800-280-1857. And I don't see that I have any questions as of now in the Q&A. If you do have any questions that come up, please feel free to reach out to us with that. Good luck in the preparation process. Thank you for joining us, and have a very nice evening.